So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Hingman Leung, the director of CURBSIDE PICKUP. Hingman, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That's wonderful. I want to ask you about some of the imagery that we see in your film, CURBSIDE PICKUP. At the very end of the film, we see the protagonist, Elaine, working on a jigsaw puzzle. And since the production design in your film is clearly something that was thought through carefully and was organized in a certain way, I wonder if there's some kind of a symbolism behind this jigsaw puzzle. Does it represent something about Elaine's life or her journey? And how did the idea come?
So the jigsaw puzzle is at the end is a bit of a wink at what happened during the first wave of the pandemic when everyone ended up being stuck indoors. I'm in a lot of like buy nothing groups, had a lot of messages going around, people looking for, oh, do you have any jigsaw puzzles hanging around in your closet? Dig it out. Because it's it's at least something to do, something to occupy your mind. And so on a very surface level, it was very much a wink at what was happening around that time. But then the film is also about, discovering yourself and reconciling a lot of the pieces of one's identity. And the jigsaw puzzle speaks to that as well. And then at the final, like, third level in terms of how that plays into the film, there's also Elaine, the main character, is dealing with a lot of mental health issues. And one of the ways that I found helpful when my thoughts are just kind of consuming me from the inside is I have to occupy my hands with something, to focus on something immediate so that I can just not have my thoughts kind of run wild. So that's the third level. Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I don't think anyone has asked me that before.
Well, it's such an interesting element to me. I'm always drawn towards production design in films and what objects or what mementos characters have around them, because those can often be insights and clues into the depths of those characters' souls. So I love that detail. Thank you very much, Hingman. Next up, we have Nicole Blundell, who is the director of PORTÉ. And Nicole, thank you very much for joining us for this Q&A today. What I'd like to ask you about your film is along similar lines to my last question for Hingman, I want to ask you about the music box, because there is a beautiful antique music box featured in your film. And we also hear the sounds of a music box on the soundtrack quite prominently. What does the music box represent to you?
Okay, so first of all, thank you. I'm so pleased that you've included my film in the festival. So I was very excited. And the music box came in a bit later in the process. Angela, who is a contemporary dancer who is in the film, brought some archival footage to the table one day, and it was her 5 months pregnant in 1997, dancing at Studio 808 in a piece that she had called the Junkyard Music Box Dancer. And I thought I was taken by her beauty, by the complexity of the choreography, and she started to recreate that with her body at 50, in full menopause, full of knowledge, wisdom, character, and grace. She had taken her choreography and brought it somewhere new. And I saw her do that one day during our rehearsal process, and I Googled music boxes, and I fell on this gorgeous music box that had sat on a woman who's now passed away, her name was Anna, on her dresser for 60 years. And her daughter said, well, what are you going to do with it? It's very fragile. And I told her that we were going to celebrate this woman and her movement and her journey. Very cyclical, so kind of going round and round like the music box dancer. And the ballerina looked just like Angela, except for the gold bodysuit. And so we incorporated it into the piece, and symbolically, she stays there round and round. And as women grew through their cycles, through their beauty and through the ages, and so she was irresistible. And so we incorporated the music box. There's Angela as a young woman dancing next to the music box dancer, next to her being 50. So it's like cycling through those ages, as opposed to making it like a treadmill. It was just coming full circle through her fertility, and on beyond that. And it was so delicately painted and intricate. And um, I offered it to Angela because we shot on her 50th birthday, and she loved it so much that she took it home and filled it with all her precious things that she had. So that's kind of how the music box, it kind of called us.
It's amazing how that can happen sometimes when you're making a film, how things just sort of fall into place all by themselves in a way. It's really wonderful because the dance that Angela does has this kind of mechanical, robotic quality to it, and then you have that reflected in other aspects of the film too. It's a beautiful choice to have this object included in the film. I really like that. What I'd like to do now is welcome our next filmmaker, Hannah Johnston, the director of Circular. Thank you very much for joining us in this Q&A today.
Thank you.
So your film was created entirely using stock footage from different websites that offer royalty-free or licensed imagery that was pre-created. But where your brilliant creativity in this film came in was in the way in which the footage was selected and edited, which is been done in a very precise manner and clearly a very careful manner too. So other than the fact that all of the imagery that we see on screen is circular in nature and has round shapes in it, what was your other search criteria in looking for the right images for this project? Were you looking for a certain color or mood or theme in the images as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So originally I started sort of from this place of hubris because I come with a tech background. So I thought, oh, like I saw this technique and I thought, oh, I could automate this. Like I could find images that are similar in color, shape, theme. Long story short, no, I couldn't. It's actually like really difficult to sort of, I guess, automate that kind of custom curation, like the look of things and sort of even just the feel of things, especially in such a quick succession, going like next, next, next. So instead, where I put my kind of technical background is like organizing all of this material. So I had like spreadsheets and collections and folders. And I was just sort of, it becomes an obsession, right? You're like always on the lookout for circles and like how they could fit in and what they would tie to next. So I sort of did lots of like big picture kind of uplifting and seeing how do these fit together? Like what's the right flow? Is there an object that would like look kind of similar but is drastically different? Or as the music changes, sort of in a jarring way, can I choose something that would be a stark contrast to that? And then I did these sort of like little micro films of each of the sort of thematic topics, and sort of so that I could focus on that just because the volume of images was so large, like it's thousands of images. But I think it was an exciting time because there is all of this content available now. And I feel like even a year or two ago, you just couldn't get that kind of like access to the media that's free and available that people are just sharing so that other people can use it. So I thought that was really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the sort of film that had it been made, in the 50s or the 60s, when some of the first experimental filmmakers were foraying into found footage, artists like Arthur Lipsett or Bruce Conner, they would have had to have gone to a film archive in order to, manually watch film prints. So it's the sort of film that really reflects the kind of internet culture that we are all a part of these days. There is this kind of database quality to the film. So it was really interesting to hear your response on that. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was great.
Thank you.
Next up, I'd like to talk to Véronique Eshaya, the director of FÉDORA. This is a beautiful film about the personal history of your great-grandmother and your family. So I have a question regarding some of the materials that we see in the film. There are some presumably real antique photographs of your great-grandmother and her family members that date back to the 30s and 40s. But we see them in the film presented in these really beautiful tableaux where they seem to have been placed newly for the purposes of film production in some scrapbooks and arranged with borders of fresh flowers around them and things like that. So I wanted to know, what was the idea behind putting these old materials in these new settings and sort of reframing them with new materials?
Yeah, and thanks so much for asking. I love working with archives, and especially for this film, I was really lucky to have access to a lot of family archives. So I had pictures of FÉDORA throughout her life. I had my grandma's wedding video. I had paintings that FÉDORA made. And I also went to Magog, to la Société d'Histoire de Magog, the archival institution where I worked with a man called Martin. And together we found all these little treasures that could help us tell FÉDORA's story. And back to the visual tableaus, I really wanted the viewer to experience the same thing I felt when I found these archives. Like if you look at a newspaper, it's moving as though you're flipping through it. The pictures themselves, they're intact, they're actual photographs I took pictures of. And there's a real familial sort of aspect to them, kind of like I'm showing you family albums. And each tableau has like a touch of FÉDORA in it, or every aspect of the film has a touch of FÉDORA for that matter, like be it through conversation with my grandmother, be it through animation, or even these archives. She's always present. She loved gardening, so that's why there's always flowers or pearls or lipstick or whatnot. Yeah.
That's really lovely. So in other words, it was a way of bringing a story to life and giving it a sense of animation, well, quite literally, because there's some animated segments in your film, and sort of making it feel fresh and new as if we were experiencing it with her for the first time.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And it's really interesting also to hear that despite the fact that this was a family story, you still did some archival research for it as well. That's really interesting. And in fact, I'm going to touch on that in my next question for you when we go through another round of questions. But for now, thank you very much, Véronique. And I'd like to welcome next Ludmylla Reis, who is the director of Away. Hi, Ludmylla. How are you today?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm great.
So I want to ask you about the construction of your film, because it has been presented to the audience in a very unusual format. It's an autobiographical story about your personal life experiences waiting for your immigration visa status to be approved or updated. But instead of appearing in the film yourself all the way through, you do appear at the end, I think. But for the most part, what we see are other people, and what we hear are other people's voices standing in for you. What led you to make that creative decision, and what were you trying to say with it?
Thank you for that question. At first, I think it was an emotional decision. I applied for one festival with this film as a docu-fiction. I think I still struggle to define what it is. Is it narrative fiction? Is it documentary? What it is? So I appreciate that question very much. But emotionally, I just wanted to have more of the people that have supported me on this process. The timing of making the film was like the peak stressful time for me. It was nearing the end of it. And I wanted to acknowledge a lot that this is not a journey that at least should happen alone. I'm approached a lot by recent immigrants that their first question is, do you make friends? Do you have friends? How do you make friends? What is going on? And I'm very lucky because I am a theater and a film person. So I meet people constantly. And I just wanted to include, at first emotionally, my friends into this film to kind of acknowledge that they were part of the story, that they were part of the narrative. I am an actor. I am a professional training actor, but I would never direct myself. So that's another reason why I'm not there at all. And it was also a process that was really hard to document as it went. Is only able to look at it from a distance later. And I think the ability of merging documentary and fiction in that, it's what allowed me to look at this story. And ultimately too, I mean, about 100% of what it's heard, it's real. It's from the journal that I wrote. It's my experience. But I was very interested in also building the other narrative with Anne visually and with the other actors and the voiceover. One feedback that I got that was pretty cool that I didn't imagine, it was someone said, oh, it feels like it's the voices of other people. And that is pretty cool because I've had other immigrants talk to me, oh, I know exactly what we were talking about. So I really appreciate that it went from me to others. And that was pretty cool gift.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think in my personal interpretation of your work, I felt like having so many other different voices coming in helped me find an entry point into the story so that I could understand and identify with the emotions of the narrator or of the protagonist. So I think it makes the film kind of have a more universal quality to it, which is really lovely. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.
So I'd like to return to Hingman Leung at this point, the director of Curbside Pickup. And you mentioned this a little bit already, some of the way in which the film was produced during and also as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that you faced of just getting this film made in terms of casting actors, doing rehearsals, shooting on location, shooting in set. It must have been tremendously difficult to do a scripted narrative drama under these conditions.
Yes, absolutely. It was a challenge, but it wasn't as hard as I imagined it to be because the team was just first of all, it was a very small team. But everyone just kind of brought their all and their best. And the amazing thing that I always tell people is that it was shot in one day. All of the scenes, the entire film shot in one day.
Wow.
And we had to find locations that allowed us to double as Elaine's basement apartment. And we were lucky to find a studio that was still in operation. And we limited the number of people that were on set. And the film itself is designed to be filmed during the pandemic because when I was writing the script, it was, I think, April or May 2020. And when I was writing this film, I was thinking, okay, if I actually want to shoot it, how would I do it? And so that was, having the pandemic in mind was part of the whole process of writing, of finding locations and finding a cast and crew and making sure that, the people that I'm working with are exactly the right people that I need on set and people who can fill in for each other, and also do multiple roles. And also having the opportunity to film in an outdoor space as well worked out for the date. And it was actually November when we shot the film, and it was starting to get really cold. And when I was first writing the script, it was around summertime or springtime. And in my head, when I imagined the story, it was kind of like a spring fling kind of date. And so when it started getting cold and it was November and having to figure out, okay, everyone needs to isolate for 2 weeks before being on set. Everyone needs to just kind of not be around other people. Make sure you don't bring anything that you don't want to give people. There are just a lot more considerations. But then we also lucked out with the weather because, the week or the few weeks before our shoot date, in November, it was starting to get really, really cold and all the leaves had fallen. But the day that we shot, the film, the temperature went up by 10 degrees. and like, this is a sign, it was meant to be. And everything worked out. So it's a combination of the right people, a lot of planning in advance, a lot of precautions, and also luck.
That's wonderful. Well, it really goes to show just how much trust is important with your collaborators on any production. Thank you so much, Henry. I'd like to ask a question for Nicole Blundell next, the director of PORTÉ. The visual look of your film is defined in many ways by the use of traditional celluloid film stock. What is it that you like most about shooting on 16mm film?
I got into film through IFCO years ago, and I took some workshops, and I had done darkroom work before. My pandemic problem, I guess, for the beginning of the pandemic, I had shot another film that I ended up developing by hand in my shed because everything was closed down. And then for this film, I had decided again, all my films have been on film. Maybe it's a leftover from my punk rock sensibilities, but it is, I'm extremely tactile, a very physical, hands-on woman. And shooting on film just kind of gives me the ability to not see, or slows me down. It doesn't allow me to see right away what I've done. It allows me to reflect on the process. I'm not a Luddite by any means. I do enjoy technology. I would never edit by hand. I've tried it. It's not for me. But I do like the impact, and I like the idea that it's a little un peu flou. So it's kind of, it's not out of focus, but it's not, HD gives you a lot of detail. And sometimes I don't want to give that much detail. I just want to allow the viewer to fill in those spaces with their imagination and their sensibility regarding that. But this was in color, so I didn't hand process it, but it did get stuck at the lab because then everything shut down after I had mailed it through Canada Post. So I was worried that it would be affected by the heat or the temperature because it is a bit fussy in terms of the way you treat it. But I was really pleased. It's just something, I'm just extremely tactile. So I just like to kind of dig in, and I love the wait period between the shooting and the processing, because all you can do is think about all the things you may have messed up or not gotten and all the things that you might have. So when you get it back, it's just a beautiful, welcoming surprise. It's kind of like giving birth and not knowing the sex of the baby, and it comes out and they're like, it could be a Big Mac and you'd be fine. And then you get the footage and then you can kind of dig into it again.
That's wonderful. I do really love the tactile quality of your film, and just generally of looking at things that have been shot on real film stock in general. Thank you very much, Nicole. Next up, I'd like to talk to Hannah Johnston, the director of Circular again. Now, the technique used to create your film is something called kinesthesis, which is a very interesting term. Maybe you could just briefly tell us what that term means.
Yeah, so I think at its kind of core, it's basically just a rapid succession of static images, typically found images, because I mean, any film is a rapid succession of images set to music or sound. But it's funny that you bring it up because I had first seen this technique used in a music video, and I was like, what is this? Where do I find more of this? This is so cool. And I think it was like halfway into creating Circular that I actually stumbled on a YouTube video that like labeled it with this term. So I don't think it's a very commonly used term, but it's an interesting, my read of it is that it's like kinesthesis or kinesis and stasis. So it's sort of like both movement and static combined, which I think is really interesting. But that's, again, just my kind of made up interpretation. I don't know if that's real.
That's a really interesting paradox because, kinetic sort of implies movement and force,
right,
and dynamism, and stasis, of course, implies still. So there's an internal paradox between movement and stasis going on there.
Exactly.
What an interesting term. Thank you so much.
Thank
I would
you.
like to ask a question of Véronique Eshaya, the director of FÉDORA. I mentioned this before a little bit, but your film brings up some of the historical and political context that your great-grandmother was surrounded by in the 1930s and 40s in Quebec. What kind of impact do you think that culture had on her life and her story?
Yeah, the 1930s, 1940s in Quebec, there was La Grande Noirceur. So there was war, depression, and on top of that, there was very deep conservatism. And those are all very essential to FÉDORA's story. So like the culture and tradition of her time played a tremendous impact on her life and her decisions that she made, and also caused her a lot of regret. She's obedient to the morals of her time. And that's what I wanted to reflect on in this film, this problem of obedience and not questioning your society or your norms or whatnot. And that's why I wanted to draw a parallel between the events that were happening then to the events that are happening today, and really asking, have we learned anything about love and humanity over time? And just like really reflecting on what it means to question cultural norms. Just to put it differently, like it's really easy today to look back and be like, hey, FÉDORA, that was a really bad choice you made. It's really easy to judge nowadays. But the question is more like, if I was born in that time, would I have done something differently? And then reflecting on today and like, is there anything that we are obedient about that maybe we're not aware of, or is there things that we should question that maybe we're not questioning? And I think that's a really topical subject at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. It's almost impossible to tell just how much the forces of economics and politics play a role in all of our lives that we're not conscious of. And it really brings an added dimension to your film in the sense of weighing what is a personal decision versus what is a decision that was influenced by these external social factors. Thank you so much, Véronique. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
My last question is for Ludmylla Reis, the director of Away. Your film concludes in a somewhat open-ended fashion. There's no definite sense of closure or resolution at the end of the film. And I was just wondering why you opted to leave the story that way. And did it have something to do with your real life timeline?
Yes, both things. I think this sense of lack of closure and wanting closure, but not being able to get it and having to have a life anyways is very at the center of the film. So in one way, I really wanted to convey that there is no, it's a repetition. It's your day and your months and your Christmases. They are pretty much, there is no ending. And you think about it and you can't think about it because otherwise you're not going to be able to work. So you work and then you go and you have a laugh with a friend and then you go home and you're like, wow, there's this thing. So in one way was that, but also in another way, the film happened when it happened, and it happened because it was done as part of the G60, which is the local festival in Ottawa, a very important festival. So it had a deadline and a timeline of its own. So I guess parallel to this artistic intention, if I would say, there was also the real timeline of I have to finish this film, and my process is not finished. Which also imparted about, okay, so what do I want to talk about it if it's not about the ending of it? Which then, the daily existence and the friendships and the support also crept into the script. And then this film, it's a product of its time in my life in many ways, including the fact that when I was able to actually lock the film, I had a really hard time editing because the filmmaker, scriptwriter, it was having all the ideas, but then the person now had to go through their own story. And I still have a really hard time watching it, to be quite sincere, since I locked it. So I was able to close it right at the end of my deadline. And on the same day, I got the email from immigration saying, oh, hey, by the way, you're approved. And I was, what is this? I guess that's filmmaking. Okay, fantastic. Fine. So I don't know if I ever will actually go back to this part of my life in this medium, and what that would look like. But this film is a product of pandemic, is a product of my timeline on the process. It's a product of my career as a filmmaker and as a storyteller. And it's very, very, very dear to my heart.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ludmylla. It's incredible to know just how much real life can play a role in shaping the stories that we see on screen. Sometimes the way in which a story has a beginning or a middle or an end, sometimes maybe not, has a lot to do with the real lives of the people that made it. I just want to say thank you to all of the filmmakers who joined us in this Q&A. I had a really excellent time chatting with you about your films. I learned a lot, and I hope the people watching at home did too. Thanks for watching.